couple of weeks ago, Pastor Luke talked about rhythms. And being somewhat musical, I like that concept of that basic beat that moves the song along, that beat that fits the words perfectly, and focus with perfection on the words, highlighting and fixing the mind towards a clear concept of the subject. A heavy, steady rhythm like your heartbeat, or a favorite theme song, reliable, like you know where the story goes, or the meter, the metrics that fit the picture of an exact reality, a reality you sense as steadfast and sure, and a true reflection of what is in your mind and your heart. God established everything from the beginning of the foundation of the world, all the way to where we are right now today. The Bible and other great books tell us about ancient countries and empires. The Bible primarily from a religious point of view, and other manuscripts tell us of customs and traditions, not necessarily religious. These other writings can give us more insight about why some traditions and customs are followed at times. Tradition. Oops, well, as some of you know, I'm kind of a show tune crazy. I just have to acknowledge that tune. Having been involved in biology and environmental studies, I've read some articles about rhythms and cycles. You don't need a lot of book learning to sense, observe, and understand these cycles and rhythms in nature. I don't like to feel that we are robot-like creatures who are confined to the cycles and rhythms that we seem totally wedded to. The benefits of learning to live in harmony with nature are highlighted by ancient manuscripts that are studied by scholars of ancient countries and empires. Even the Bible tells us of the benefits of learning to live in harmony with nature and within rules and regulations as they were understood at that time. Things happen along the road to enlightenment. Each of us need to imagine, conceive, and contrive how knowledge of today can best be used to understand why our ancient ancestors acted the way they did in relationship to the environment and to each other. Even before the Dark Ages, brilliant minds questioned how and why things worked the way they did. In our time, we understand that our knowledge about the COVID-19 virus was very limited and difficult to grasp and understand at first. Later, when many statistics were somewhat understood, procedures were developed. Some people in high places had to admit that to be effective, they needed to react and respond to new evidence of what's going on. Oh, that's another great tune, but not in our hymnal. Some other people did not feel that the new evidence was reliable, so they didn't feel compelled to change. And I get that. I really do. We were all raised in different families, different situations. I think most of us don't like to feel that we're living in the same old world. Does that sound familiar? Do you know what I mean? God presents us with challenges and opportunities each and every day. If we ignore or refuse to react to them, then we could be left living the same old life in the same old world. Nature presents us with so many examples of cycles that nourish and replenish the blessed world in which we live. All creatures, great and small, designed by our Creator God to function in this world. They function as our friends and allies. They can help us. Or if we mess up this habitat, their habitat in this world, we could cause them to become extinct. So, who really cares? What direct impact on our lives do any creatures have, big or little, macroscopic or microscopic? Well, it kind of makes me understand just why some of these creatures might want to stay in the ground 17 years at a time instead of having to deal with other animals and humans all the time every year. Now, the maps I've seen indicate that the massive numbers of the 17-year locusts in our state will be limited to counties south and east of here, mainly those right next to Indiana. If you have an interest in experiencing them, it might be worth a trip. I was really impressed by the emergence of some locusts. I think it was back in the summer of 70 or 71 that Lila and I were at EIU in Charleston in Coles County. The 13-year locust emerged in a wooded area just a few miles south of town. It was a fairly large state or county park. The sun was getting low, but even under the largest trees, we could see that the road was moving. No matter how slow we drove, 5 miles an hour or even less, thousands of the creatures were under the car. But in less than a minute, you could not see your tracks on the road because hundreds of thousands were still going across. When God or nature motivates massive migrations of living organisms to move, then they move. Sometimes, if they do not move, they die. No doubt we've all seen movies that depict the massive movements of the bison or buffalo or antelope in our Great Plains West, or the movements of the wildebeest and other wild animals in Africa. Perhaps you've heard stories of the passenger pigeon, one of those species now extinct, but when they would migrate, at least yearly, they would darken the sky, completely blocking out the sun, not just making shadows, but completely blocking out the sun. Let's take a long step back in time, here now, and listen to this passage from a book called The Unity of the Church, attributed to Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage, in AD 250. The church is spread both far and wide by an increase in fruitfulness. There are many rays of the sun, but only one light. Many branches of a tree, but one strength based on its tenacious root. Separate a ray of the sun from its body of light, and its unity does not allow a division of light. Break a branch from a tree. When broken, it will not be able to bud. Thus also the church, shone over with the light of the Lord, sheds forth her rays over the whole world, yet it is one light which is everywhere diffused, nor is the unity of the body separated. Her fruitful abundance spreads her branches over the entire world. Her head is one, her source one, and she is one, plentiful in the results of fruitfulness. From her womb we are born, by her milk we are nourished, by her spirit we are animated. This passage is a quotation from a book called Common Roots by Robert E. Weber in 1978. So, what in the world did I mean by that passage? Well, parts of it kind of remind me of an old line from one of those old cigarette commercials. Do you remember any of those? The Virginia Slims commercial? How's that saying go? You've come a long way, baby. As a church, we have grown, and we have spread around the world. We have had a few branches blow off or break off. We have had a few branches that have become rotten and hollow. We're not trying to block out the sun, but are ever reaching out toward that singular force, the pure, unchanging, secure, safe light of God Himself. Now, you don't have to go back nearly 2,000 years or research books from across the whole world to find inspiring words about our church or the inspiration of nature. I recently got access to a book called Sourdough and Soul Food, 1993, written by Dr. Harry Sanders, a past pastor of the Baptist Church in Minonk for way over 30 years, and he's been retired for a few decades, a couple decades anyway. This is a chapter that's called A Forest Full of Christians. And this chapter really stuck with me, and I think you'll understand why. Being in the woods that morning was almost like being in church. Not just because being outdoors makes you feel closer to God, but also because as I looked at all the trees, I thought I saw a lot of Christians I knew. There were tall and sturdy oaks with their branches spreading far out along the ground. They reminded me of some mature Christians, deeply rooted in the faith, who spread their love and concern far out through the church and the world. There were many young trees that seemed to be straining to grow tall, and were sending their branches almost straight up so that the leaves could open in the sun. And they reminded me of the many young and growing Christians in our fellowship who are reaching so eagerly upward for fellowship with God. We saw several trees that once had had double trunks, and one had fallen, leaving the other to fill its place. And that reminded me of some in our fellowship who have lost their life partner, but continued to carry on, trusting and praising the Lord. There were a number of huge stumps, remnants of once mighty trees. It seemed that around these stumps there was almost invariably a grove of strong young trees that had come from their seed. They reminded me of some faithful saints that once filled the great spaces in our fellowship, now gone, but still remembered, and in their place now stand other strong Christians. A forest full of Christians. The power and majesty of cycles and rhythms sustain and renew much of God's creation. A godly truth. He has a place for each of us, a plan for each of us in His cycle of life and in His rhythm of life. Where do we stand on the fundamental foundation of Christ's church? Where do we fall from that fundamental foundation of Christ's church? As we strive to fully understand why we are here now and what God has placed us here to do, let us at least acknowledge that God only knows. Let us know that we are loved and that we are residents here, but for a short time. Amen.